All right, welcome to your next set of notes. Here are your directions for this one. For this set of notes and every note set after this, you must fill it out and then turn it back in. Again, only this note set and all to follow. So no, you do not have to go back to the ones that you've done already. Our problem is that people are not actually watching the PowerPoints and filling stuff in on their own. How do I know? Because my count total on my video is like 15, which means I have 60 of you, so 45 are not watching it. So you are to turn your note sets in back to me from this point forward. So this note set will be due by tomorrow. Yes, you need to fill out the questions on the back as well. So make sure you scroll down completely to the 2 pages and fill out everything you need. All you have to do is listen to my beautiful voice and listen to what I tell you, and it should all be there in about 25 minutes or less, probably less. So it's really not that much work for you to do this. And you get points for it. So don't blow it off because some of you are late with every single paper you've gotten so far. And keep in mind, this fourth 9 weeks, as weird as it is going to dictate your eligibility for your fall sports. So some of you really need to get on it and stay with it. So here we go. Let's do Italian literature. Since we were talking about vernacular, which in our last set of notes meant writings that are not of the church, that they are of other things, that it's important that we talk about these people. I think we have 1, 2, 3 people to talk about. And these, no, 4, I can't count. These are 4 actually of my favorite writers, though they're kind of high level. It still is something that you guys could actually understand. It's not too difficult. So you have, first of all, this guy got a big old grin on his face. So the first thing is we're talking about political writings, and it says secular. Remember, secular is not of the church. Actually, vernacular is what I screwed up. Vernacular is written in common speak. Secular, that is not of the church. Sorry, I flipped my 2 vocabulary words there. So your first guy is a guy named Niccolo Machiavelli. Most people just call him Machiavelli. And if you are a Tupac fan, Tupac Shakur, that's the name that he went by on one of his albums, was Machiavelli. And it was all about this guy and what he wrote. So Machiavelli was from Italy. Remember, you have the taking off of this Renaissance time period in places that have a lot of money. So Machiavelli was there in Florence, and he was a diplomat. Think about him and know what a diplomat is. Well, I guess if you read the notes up there, it says a negotiator and a deal maker. So he's somebody that works in the government in terms of politics, specifically with other countries, and that's what we still have diplomats today. So as he goes out and he travels, he's a writer, especially on politics and other things. And I know you say, well, it doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun. But in this case, it is. The Prince is a really good book because it talks about what kind of things are needed in politics. A lot of this does apply in modern times. So he writes this book. He writes several different ones. But the main one we'll talk about is called The Prince in 1513. So 500 some odd years later, it's still important. And in it, he claims that people were greedy and self-centered. So what you think about, we would ask this in class, and we'd have a decent discussion on it, but it's kind of hard to when you're just listening to me babble. But he said that people were greedy and self-centered, that they were mostly thinking about themselves. So I guess the question for you is, do you think that's true or not? Now, granted, a lot of you guys think that you're good people, and you probably are, most, I suppose. Me too. But at the same time, if we're looking at our own lives, don't we do a lot of things that are for ourselves and not always for other people? And that we tend to look at ourselves in a certain light compared to other people, and don't we want a lot of things materialistically or otherwise? To which the point where, you know, I can agree with him. And I think there's extreme levels. There's a variety of levels. Clearly, some people, and you can think of maybe your peers or adults, that are on the extreme side of both of these things, and some who are maybe not so much. But at the heart of it, he's saying people are greedy and self-centered. And he said that when you look at rulers, rulers should not necessarily try to be good. So if we're looking at, say, presidents or politicians, he's not saying that they couldn't not be good, but at the same time, that there might be things that are involved in politics where, you know, they can't always always do what's good and necessarily right, in that he's saying that they shouldn't always think about this because that could harm them politically. And instead, here's what he says. He says to keep power and protect their city, they should do whatever's necessary, including killing and lying. So I want you to think about this one. They should do whatever's necessary to keep power and protect their city, including killing and lying. So don't you think that that is what most politicians, most presidents try to do, leaders, and you can even think of other countries too. Aren't they trying to keep power? And aren't they trying to protect their city or their country? Now then the question becomes killing and lying. I'm not saying necessarily that that is right, but in the same terms, I know enough about politics that that does happen at times. Can you think of any time when killing and lying might be good? Killing, I'm thinking more of like, not that I'm saying it's good again, but assassinating someone from another country or who might uh, be a terrorist, uh, lying, maybe not necessarily telling the full truth to citizens when it could be harmful or could cause concerns or riots. Again, I'm not justifying any of these, but I'm just trying to get you to understand what Machiavelli is saying in this, that this is what politicians and this is what people higher up in government tend to do so that they can protect their own citizens. And today, what that means is it takes on its own term from this guy's name. Because of what he wrote about in The Prince, to be Machiavellian means that you have a tendency to be tricky and not necessarily think about being good. Now, I'm not pointing fingers at any presidents, past or present, that might have done that, but there are quite a few have been seen as Machiavellian, in that they're not always on the up and up, but it doesn't mean that they're not thinking about the good of the country in this case. So to give you an example of this, there's a section in the book on 614, and I don't expect you to have your books out, right? So I'll read it to you. I had it ready to go. That would be helpful. All right, so on 614, there's just a little blurb that you should have read the other day that says, in Machiavelli's masterpiece, he explains his theories about human nature in his quotes. You should consider then that there are two ways of fighting, one with laws and the other with force. The first is properly a human method, the second belongs to beasts. But as the first method does not always suffice, which means meet your needs, you sometimes have to turn to the second. Thus a prince must know how to make good use of both the beast and the man. So if we're thinking about this, that there are times when the president needs to have a human side. And you can think of like natural disasters and such, or what we're currently going through, that you need someone who's going to help alleviate any concerns of the citizens and such. But at the same time, you need a beast or someone who is willing to use their power in case something arises, especially a challenge from a foreign country or terrorist activity. So good politicians, he's saying, need to be able to use both of these, the man and the beast, to be tricky. So it gives you a lot of stuff to think about from 500 years ago or so that still applies today. The second writing, and this is more of social writing. So social writing really takes off at this time period when people start writing about what's going on in their own world. Maybe not politics, maybe not religion, but things in society that are kind of overlooked, especially with this guy's haircut. I'm not sure what he's doing there. But anyways, moving on. So we'll talk about a guy named Jonathan Swift, who you might be familiar with simply with his novel, Gulliver's Travels, which is the story of Gulliver and his travels to a place called Lilliputian, where he has some interacting with the little people here. There's a Jack Black movie there a few years ago that I think it was Gulliver's Travels, and he was in it, and that actually wasn't too bad. But Swift was a little bit different. So Swift had this proposal, or wrote this little thing called a modest proposal. And what you had at the time period was Ireland had a lot of orphans, and they really needed to reduce the population. So people were not addressing this issue with there being so many orphans in Ireland. And this is called, you're addressing the elephant in the room. If you think of that, if you think of being in a room and there's an elephant, it's hard to ignore an elephant in a room with you. And that's what they're doing, is they're ignoring the elephant in the room, and he's saying we need to address this thing before anything gets further out of control. So he comes up with this proposal. And it was very controversial at the time period, and I'll tell you about it here. I wish I brought my little book home. I didn't realize it'd be this far out of school, and I had a little book that has an excerpt of it. But anyways, here's what he thought. He thought that a good way to kill two birds with one stone, to reduce the population and to feed people who were hungry, is to eat children and orphans and make them into purses. Now I know it sounds gross, but hear me out on this one. The guy knew what he was talking about, right? He said, we got a lot of orphans. No one cares about the orphans. We got hungry people. We need to reduce our population. So literally, let's kill two birds with one stone, as I said, and eat them. Then people are well fed, and your population goes down, and make them into purses too, and you make a lot of profit off of it. Now, it may seem like kind of gross, but buy into it, it wouldn't be such a bad idea, I don't think, right? So he proposes this idea, and he puts it into writing, and it gets out. And it angers the public. Now, some of you are like, oh, Mr. Steyer, what are you talking about? They're really eating kids. Now, hold on just a second. It angers the public, and it causes outrage. People are furious. They want to find Swift and hang him up by his boxer shorts or whatever he wore at the time period. And what they weren't figuring out is that he was actually speaking in tongue-in-cheek. Now, does anybody know what tongue-in-cheek means? How about sarcasm? You know what sarcasm is? Okay, so what this actually was, and this is what I'm saying here, is he wrote this in tongue-in-cheek. He was being sarcastic. What he wanted to do was address the elephant in the room, and that elephant in the room was these orphans that no one cared about. No one was doing anything about. So he comes up with this idea to get people concerned about it. Now, sure, it is way out there in left field. It's something that no one should ever do, and it causes outrage, and people want to kill him, and he does exactly what he set out to do. But it took this type of writing to get people to be concerned about the orphans, and it did. It worked. So now what the public does is they take care of the orphans. The public now saw what could happen if no one did anything. So what he showed them was like a worst-case scenario. And this is where you get what you call satire. That's what it is. He wrote about something that was a real issue, but put more of a satirical or supposedly funny spin on it to get people to realize that they need to do something about it. Like, again, think of it this way. You had orphans for a long time, and people are saying we need to do something about it. We need to do something about it. And they're like, yeah, let's just kick that can down the road, and someone else will deal with it. But now Swift says, all right, well, let's eat these kids. No, we can't do that type of thing. It's horrible. No cannibals in our place. Okay, so that's how he was able to use his writings to influence people to be inspired and do something about it socially. So it does work. Your other types of vernacular writings at the time period. Again, vernacular, something that we have mentioned before, and I've used in class, is writing in everyday language. Vernacular is not Latin. That was your fancy language at the time period. That's something that I think your video talked about yesterday, where the Catholic Church was doing all their writings in Latin, and they're speaking in Latin, and this angered people like Martin Luther, because they were the only ones, the church, the only ones that really understood it and spoke it, and so therefore the people who were going to these churches didn't really understand it, and they had a lot of control over them simply by language. So now these writers are writing in just the common speak of people, Italian and German, in English, rather than the fancy writings that no one read. So what this does is it opens two things up. Number one, it opens the lower classes, mid to lower class people, to be able to read these writings. And secondly, it opens up broader audiences for these early authors who could write in a variety of languages and not just in the fanciful Latin instead. And one example of this early on is a guy named Chaucer. Looks like he's got his nightcap on. He's got a good night. But Chaucer wrote in English. And English is not a beloved language. It's not a romance language of the world. It's kind of common speak, and depending on the dialect, it might not sound like the most intelligent language in the world. Well, his main book that he wrote was called The Canterbury Tales. So he really does that twofold thing with vernacular. Number one, he's writing it in a common language. Number two, he's writing about common people. Usually, the stuff that you wrote about at the time period you're writing for a higher class level audience. But now he's writing for lower class people in what's typically seen as a lower class language. So this book is called The Canterbury Tales, and in it he talks about the journeys of 29 pilgrims going to the city of Canterbury, hence the Canterbury Tales. And it's people of all walks of life. So it's kind of interesting to see him show what the lives of like all of these people of different walks of life are, from rich or to poor. And that's what it says here in this point. So the different levels of English society from rich to poor. But normally writings did not do that. So again, he's writing in common speak. Don't be offended. English is not a fanciful language. And then he's writing for all walks of life as well. So that kind of opens things up in terms of the writings. And if you look there on the right hand side, it is part of the Canterbury Tales. It almost looks like it's backwards to me. But anyways, the last type of writing. This one is political. This one is my favorite. This is one that if we were in class, we would have some fun with, which makes me sad that we're not in class because I have some activities with this. But this one is an author named Dante Alighieri. So most people just call him Dante because the Alighieri part is a little bit difficult. So as you can see in these pictures here, well, it kind of has to do with heaven and hell. Such bad things to write about at the time. That's secular. You don't do that. You don't talk about hell. Well, this guy named Dante actually did way back when in the early 1300s. He was a poet of, again, Florence, Italy. That's where most of your fancy writers were from because they had the money. And he wrote one of the world's greatest poems called The Divine Comedy, 14,000 lines long. It's basically a book, but it's called a poem because of the style of writing that it actually is done. Now, this Divine Comedy is not about comedy whatsoever. This was, again, like a political satire. This is something that he imagined in his own head, and it was all very similar to, like, when I always point the picture of this as being like The Wizard of Oz. Have you ever seen the movie The Wizard of Oz with Dorothy, Toto, and the Wicked Witch of the West? All right, it really is not about the Emerald City and a house falling on a witch and a little dog named Toto. It really is not. If you want to do some research on it, you can go back and look and see that the guy who wrote it, L. Frank Baum, I think I got that correct, L. Baum, something like that. But anyways, it was about politics of the early 1900s, and the characters were supposed to be people politically. And a lot of people don't realize that, so you can go back on your own and look at it if you want to. But that was very similar to what this was. So the setup of it is you have this guy named Dante. Yes, he put himself in his own book. This guy named Dante, and he was a very religious guy. He was into the church and all. So when people talk about this book and say it's evil, it's satanic, it's actually not, because he was a Christian. And so he saw a lot of problems politically and within the church. So he wrote this poem kind of as a play on that and satire to get people to understand what was going on in the church that he had issues with, which if you listened to the video yesterday, included selling off kind of the rituals of the church that people had to pay for to have communion and to have the forgiveness of their sins, and he did not like that. He said that was not something that should have to be bought from believers in the church. And before we go on, if you like this or interested in this at all, it's a very tough read, but I enjoyed it. I read it in college, but I actually enjoy the artistry. I actually have this book that's pictured here at school, but a guy named Gustave Doré did the artwork for it, and you can find some books of the Divine Comedy that have this art in it, and I've got one at school. So anyways, you've got this guy named Dante, the main character, and his long-lost love named Beatrice has disappeared. His long-lost love, she's lost now, has disappeared, and he has to go through 3 parts: heaven, the inferno, the purgatorio, which is purgatory, kind of the middle, and then the paradiso, which is heaven, to try and find his long-lost love. So this is kind of what I call one of the earliest horror stories of the time period, because it does involve some like graphic imagery of some beasts and monsters and mythological characters. It also has historical figures who are in this as well. Cleopatra is in this. That his vision, and again, this is just a vision, that there are different levels of hell, that there are 9 levels of hell split into 2 different parts, and that you have depending on the crimes that you did or sins that you did in life, that dictated where you went to hell, and then there was some kind of punishment for you down there. And people bought into this. They thought it was like real. And it was just from his imagination. And again, there's a deeper meaning to it. If you just look at it at a surface level and say it's this religious book, it's really not. It's more political in nature. And he actually had the Pope at the time period in the book because, again, he was calling out the church for different things. So this is why it's such a deep and interesting book to me. I really do enjoy it. And, again, the imagery of it, the logical figures that are involved in it. But people took it way too seriously. They got this book at the time period and was like, oh, this guy had a vision. It really was hell, and it was really all about heaven. And they believed a lot of the stuff that they saw in it, and which wasn't necessarily true. This is very similar to in the 1940s. A lot of people, when they didn't have TV, they listened to radio shows. And one of the radio shows was called War of the Worlds, and written by H.G. Wells. And so they did this radio show about this invasion from Mars, and they made it so it sounded like a news report, and it was all fake. It was all for entertainment, but people believed it when they heard it, and they ran out on the streets and had their guns pointed at the sky because the guy on the radio told them that the aliens were attacking. And to me, it's kind of what this book is he's trying to make a point, but it might be a little bit too deep for most people, politically and socially, and instead they look at it just at surface level and think it's all about heaven and hell. But in it, he does go through these three places, and this is some artwork from it. This is Dante and his host here. Trying to think of what his name is. I don't have it in my notes right now. But as they're entering into the depths of hell, and in his very last level of hell, there sits Satan, right there with his wings and stuff. There's Dante right there. Virgil is his helper here. And down below in the very last level of hell is Satan, who's half frozen in a lake of ice, and he's forever flapping his wings trying to get out of it. And in his mouth are the people who commit the worst sin, to which Dante was betrayal of a Lord. So in the mouth of Satan is Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus, but also Brutus and Cassius, who betrayed Julius Caesar. And so they're forever being gnawed in the mouth of the devil. So again, you can imagine people seeing this in the 1300s, that they're probably pretty shocked. I mean, a lot of people might be shocked at this at the time period. There's also a very popular video game based on this. I remember playing that back in the day. I think it was on the Xbox. It might have been 360, called Dante's Inferno, which it wasn't a bad game at all. But again, this book described all the horrible punishments in hell for various sins. It was very shocking to the people at the time period. But it was, again, it was an allegory. It was just something that he used to get people to understand the ills of society and the church, and it either worked or it didn't. But I think it's a very good book to read. So here's a couple other images from this for those of you that are interested in it. It's kind of cool to see, I say cool to see, but what circle of hell you might go into depending on what your worst crimes were. Limbo is kind of those who aren't either bad enough or good enough for either space. Chiron is the guy who's taking you along all throughout. The lustful, the gluttonous, those who eat a bunch of food and gluttony, the hoarders and the spendthrifts, the wrathful, and then you go down to your lower levels. Lower hell, these are your panderers and seducers, yucky flatterers, so all the brown nosers there. I'm not sure what that one is. I have to look that one up. Sorcerers, veriters? I don't remember either. Hypocrites, thieves, deceivers, sowers of discord, falsifiers, and then down below is the last level again with the devil. So don't get to that level. There you go. So these are traitors in that last level. Traitors to their family, traitors to their country, traitors to guests, traitors to the lords, and those are the ones who are in that very last level right there. So anyways, here's actually a little thing. I don't know if it's still working or not, but it's a little survey that you can take to talk to somebody, I think a college or something did it, to see which level of hell you might go to depending on questions that you do. So you can feel free to try that or not. That's entirely up to you. But hopefully through this set of notes, you can see the different types of writings from the time period and how things really evolved from being religious in nature in terms of writings to this different type of secular and vernacular type writing. So anyways, turn in your note set, just this one, and any to follow, none that we've done previously, you don't have to do. Make sure you answer questions down below, and have yourself a good day.